So this week we are going to talk UK politics a fair amount because it's a disaster, basically. As if the Conservatives weren't enough of a disaster, the Labour Party...
If you think America's a disaster, take a look at the UK. There's only one disaster in the UK. It's diversification. The UK specialises in diversified political garbage, whereas America tends to focus it. So let's have a look at Jeremy Corbyn, though, in particular this week, because he's got a new party, which is called Your Party, or at least that's the working title of it. But first of all, Jeremy Corbyn was demonised, wasn't he, by and large, because totally.
He was seen as being anti-Israel before everybody else discovered what Israel...
He was anti-Israel, and he was described as being anti-Jewish. Let's get that out right from the beginning.
Yeah, because there's no definition. That's all. There's
a definition which makes being anti-Israel anti-Jewish. Okay, I've forgotten the particular some law in the UK. Which unfortunately Jeremy agreed to as a definition of anti-Semitism, and I don't know the details, and I'm not going to bother looking it up because I'm so pissed off overall about this. But the basic definition was if you criticise Israel, you're anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. So anti-Semitic was criticising Israel,
and a support of terrorism, which is what has happened to George Galloway, who has been arrested on terrorism charges.
Give us a better. I know how well you do your Galloway. I wanted to, because I spent some time in Scotland with George, actually in his house, George and the family.
You see that?
By
association,
you do a better George Galloway than George Galloway.
Yeah, he's lost it. Yeah.
Anyway, just to get the
by association. I can't do it anymore. You see, I've lost it. I've lost my George Galloway. But you're
still pretty good. Still pretty good. Anyway, George and his wife were coming back from Russia. They had to fly to Russia through one of the Arabic states to get, because there's no direct flights anymore from London to Moscow, for one of Putin's parades. His politics are more socialist than mine in that sense, because I'm a critic of the Marxist theory of revolution, so that makes me a bit sceptical about what happened to Russia anyway. Anyway, long story. But they went there just for the parade, recognising the Red Army's role in the overthrow of Hitler was absolutely critical. Came back and got arrested at the airport under the Terrorism Act, or detained. And they were there for about 5 or 6 hours, and then he was released. And this is absolutely ludicrous. So far, Trump hasn't yet jailed a member of the Democratic Party. But here we have Starmer, has an act drafted by Starmer, has put in jail, has detained, if not quite arrested, the leader of the 6th largest political party in Britain.
Yeah. And yet, Margaret Thatcher years ago befriended General Pinochet, responsible for the killing of hundreds of people, so state-sponsored domestic terrorism, really. And she put him up at her place and didn't get any charges. So, go figure. But Jeremy Corbyn, meanwhile, he was seen because of that association with Israel. Or against Israel was seen,
with Palestine.
His association with Palestine, for example, exactly before Palestine was basically razed to the ground. But he obviously saw that coming, but was also standing up for the Palestinian people because it was blockaded at the time. It wasn't, it was a not even a state, and it was unable to function. I mean, no one can support Hamas, but the people of Palestine you can certainly support. But anyway, he's seen as being unpopular by the Labour Party. But the point is, I think it's 42 years he's been continuously voted as the MP for North Islington. So 1983, yes, 42 years is how long he's been there. And at the 2017 general election, he got way more votes than Keir Starmer did. So it's just the way the first past the post system works. So he got an extra 30 seats for the Labour Party, 262 MPs with 40% of the popular vote. By contrast, Keir Starmer got less than 34% of the popular vote, but somehow still became voted in as Prime Minister. In fact, he got the lowest ever vote share ever recorded for a winning party in the history of the UK. So again, it's just an example of how the first past the post system works. So actually, if Jeremy Corbyn had been standing at the last election, he would have won with a bigger majority for the Labour Party, and probably wouldn't have thrown it away as fast as Keir Starmer has managed to throw it away.
This is the amazing thing. I mean, a poll just came out recently from the Ipsos, I think it's called, showing that Keir Starmer is now the most unpopular Prime Minister in the history of polling. He has an approval rating of about 13%, and there's 8% that are undecided. I think he's got 7. I'm not looking at the numbers now, but about 79% negative approval. I've never seen any political. First, I'd have to say two things about the Labor Party. First of all, when I arrived in the UK and then saw Jeremy Corbyn rise to power, and then saw he was always vilified by people inside his own party. I had never, ever seen anything of that scale in any political setting whatsoever. That includes student politics at university. The extent of vilification from within his own side and live on TV. I forgot it was Margaret, somebody or other, going anti-Semite when he's giving a bloody press interview.
Even worse than the politics at university saying. So University of New South Wales, Tony Abbott versus
Sydney, University of Sydney. Tony Abbott didn't quite ever go quite that far. Let's put it this way. I was faster than him, so he never caught me when he chased after me when I was putting posters up around Sydney. And he probably would have known a pretty diadem if he had caught me.
What was on your posters?
Political economy, supporting the political economy campaign at Sydney University back in the 70s. The thing is, if you attack somebody in student politics, there had to be at least some link with reality in what you did. Whereas to call Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite when the man had been in so many pro-Jewish marches against Jewish persecution in the UK. There was, if you go back to the Mosley period where the fascism was literally on the march in Britain, his mother was heavily involved in the campaign against Mosley. So you get this family history and personal history of being absolutely outraged by anti-Semitic behaviour. And how does the Labor Party right get rid of him? They accuse him of anti-Semitism. I'm sorry. Even student politics would be laughing at the accusation. Instead, it got acted upon. We got Keir Starmer and the worst political performance in the history of the UK. Possible exception of Charles II.
Well, Keir Starmer, it was going back a bit, isn't it? So Keir Starmer really trying to be just the Tory party light, isn't he? I mean, he just doesn't want to upset anybody, and therefore he is upsetting everybody. But it's interesting as well, the things that at the time everyone was going, that is just going a step too far. Now everyone's going, well, why aren't we doing this? So, for example, he wanted to nationalise the railways, and everyone was going, well, who's going to pay for that? But now everyone wants to nationalise the railways. He wanted to nationalise energy and water and the postal service. All of those things now, you look at how they're performing and everyone's going, well, why were they ever privatised in the first place?
In the first place, yeah.
So, I mean, it's
he came in with a campaign saying he's going to know.
And also the things, the utilities that largely in most countries in the world are owned by the state.
And there's a good reason for it. It's the time horizon. This is Avner Offer, my good friend Avner's excellent book, The Public-Private Divide, makes the point that the reason you don't want the private sector managing things like water and sewerage is because the maintenance is necessary, the long-term maintenance, they'll neglect, and it takes it because it increases short-term profits with the time horizon they've got, and everybody benefits from sewerage, but if you sell sewage to people who can afford to buy it, not everybody gets sewage, and those who don't get sewage give diseases to those who have. There's good reasons that the public should provide that, and do the long-term boring stuff that they will continue doing, because the government doesn't have to worry about getting a rate of return over time or paying interest on debt over time, which is mistaken understanding of politics.
Sewage removal you're talking about. People don't want to pay for sewage. They actually, I mean, just being probably too anal about it. There's a bad choice of words. But anyway, so the other things he wanted Britain to be back in the single market. Well, I think now everyone realises what a mistake Brexit was, if they didn't realise before. He wanted to ban 0-hour contracts, raise the minimum wage to £10. I think that's already had.
This is what Starmer's policies before he came to power, or are you talking Jeremy Corbyn?
I'm talking Jeremy Corbyn. So the interesting thing was, a lot of these were what Keir Starmer was also advocating.
He said he'd do it, and then he did the opposite when he got in power. Yeah.
So, I mean, they were actually, side by side through a lot of this. So minimum wage of £10, I think that's happened already. Get rid of those bogus self-employment programs, like where a company says, "Oh yeah, we're not going to give you a job. Just employ yourself and contract out, and we'll buy from you because we don't want to have to pay your national insurance contributions and all that." So making all of that illegal. 12 months maternity pay, a whole load of things. But the question that was raised at the time, and we hear it time and time again, of course, is how do you pay for all of this?
And that's why I gave the opening speech at Jeremy Corbyn's Peace and Justice Project conference on last Sunday, explaining that the government does not borrow. Okay, the government creates money when it pays interest. It can pay too much to the financial sector, but it doesn't actually, it's not borrowing in the sense that we borrow when we have to get money off a bank or we can't do anything. It's the question whether the government creates the money or not. And when you understand that, all the limitations disappear. So the reply to come back to say not just Jeremy Corbyn's party, but Zach Polanski with the Greens and George Galloway with the Workers' Party is that everything you wish to do to reverse the mistakes of privatisation is financially doable, and you can then maintain those services over time. So there is no financial constraint on the state doing that.
Yeah, and we've said this time and time again, of course, and it's, let's repeat it again, just the 30-second soundbite on this. The government spends money in the economy. It goes into people's bank accounts because if they're spending it, they're not spending it on the government. They're spending it on the real economy. So it goes into people's or company bank accounts. They pay for that by issuing bonds. The bonds are
no. They changed the asset backing it by issuing bonds. This is when the bonds themselves. If the bonds weren't issued, the consequence would be the government have an overdraft at the central bank, or the central bank would own the bonds rather than the private banks. The bonds themselves play no role in financing government spending.
Right, but they have to issue those bonds because that's the regulation.
Legally required,
because they can't go into the red by too far in their bank account with the Bank of England. So those bonds are issued, and those bonds either sit in the in the reserves of the commercial banks, but also can find their way back into the private sector where they are bought.
Well, the bonds are held by the banks, but they normally sell 90% of them to the private sector, therefore cancelling government money creation in the process. So that's why we had the trust crisis, because the bonds were sold to pension funds, and then with interest rates being raised by the Bank of England, but allegedly to fight inflation. That's not how you fight inflation, but that's what they did. That devalued the bonds that pension organisations had, and that's what caused the trust crisis. So
so if it was all bought by the private sector, none of it stayed within the banking sector, 100% went, then all the money that was created by the government spending would be spent, but would be bought up by the private sector. So you'd actually have, in terms of the money growth, you'd have no extra money. All you in effect have done is taken money that was sitting in the private sector and moved it to the public sector, but the private sector is still sitting with those bonds. They can still cash in those bonds if they want at some point in the future, and they're still earning money in terms of
interest,
coupon payments from the government. So, and that's for a lot of people, that's their investment in the future. It's their pension funds, for example. So it's not a debt as such, because it's being seen as an investment. It's talked about as an investment. I'm going to invest in bonds. You don't go, I'm going to fund government debt by buying bonds. You're talking about an investment for the future. So do they get it when you talk to politicians about this?
I think I got through with the speech I gave at Jeremy's, well, not party, it's the Peace and Justice Project. It did get through to the audience, but it's still complicated for people to understand. But it's possible now to have that change, because with Labor and Tory, there was just no chance of getting this argument through. But you now have three new the Greens is a revived political party with Zach Polanski leading it. Yeah. Jeremy attempting to start a new party, but of course we saw a ridiculous internecine strife just before the conference I spoke at a couple of weeks ago, and George Galloway's party. So there's three possible parties that the light bulb could go off for them. And then what it means is they can say, we're not constrained by government debt. we can put all those what should be public services back into public ownership. We can then do the maintenance that wasn't done by the private sector. We can build the dams that the private sector ignored the need for, and so it's possible for these new parties to come forward and displace, I hope, both the Tories and the Labor Party.
So I noticed you haven't mentioned the LibDems in there, and yet they are...
Yeah, LibDems are a possibility, but I mean, it's a bit like trying to persuade a souffle to rise again. If you know the old Paul Keating put down about... you want to do that one? I mean, you're pretty good at your invitations. Paul Keating talking about the leader of the opposition, calling him a souffle never rises twice. The LibDems, I'd like them to succeed, but they still sound like a souffle to me.
Right. And yet, they've got more seats than they've ever had before, and all the projections are that they're going to get more at the next election. I did a podcast recently, the YCAV, where we were talking about, well, where are the Lib Dems? But they are still, because why aren't they saying more? And actually, almost as though they listened to that podcast, now they are starting to get a bit more vocal. But they're projected to actually potentially be the second party at the next election. So they would actually
be the first.
Well, that's assuming Labour wins again.
Forget that. I'm sorry.
Well, who do you think?
I'm not that sort of economist.
But
I won't make ridiculous assumptions.
Well, so the answer is the Reform Party wins, doesn't it? And then
exactly. That's the main worry the main worry for UK politics is that not that Labor will lose, but the Reform will win.
Yeah.
And then you're going to get Trump-style politics. God knows that's we're still talking 2028 unless there's a complete collapse in by-elections.
Yeah.
Most likely it won't be to 2028 the election occurs, but if that's your prospect, you're going to get a delayed version of Trump in the UK. So what I'm hoping is that there may be the Lib Dems, but those three parties, the new ones, could actually decide to exploit the first past the post system and not run and select one candidate from each party to run the most favourable one for the particular electorate they're in. So George Galloway would take parts of the north. You'd have Greens taking most of the south. You might get Jeremy Corbyn's party, if it survives, and that's still, I think, a question mark after the events with Zara Sultana, just before the PJP conference. If it survives, then it could take the middle of the country in that sense. And then you'd have three progressive political groups dominating the numbers in the House of Commons, and therefore not electing Farage as Prime Minister.
So those events that you're talking about. So this was almost like the deputy leader of the party not seeing eye to eye with Jeremy Corbyn. Is that basically what was happening there?
With the disputes inside your party?
Yeah.
You're lucky to be out of the country recently, mate.
Yeah. No,
what happened? I mean, to me, it seems like impatience on the side of Zara Sultana, because Jeremy is a very nice, reasonable man who takes a long time to do a lot of things, but does them. And I've got a feeling it just seems to be impatience that Sultana whacked up a membership campaign under the banner of our party, not your party, but our party. The money apparently still went to exactly the same trust system that had been set up for the Your Party group. So there was no attempt to siphon money away, and it wasn't fraudulent. But to me, it strikes like she's a young person who got frustrated with an old person who moved slowly, and therefore decided to do some stuff unilaterally, and then put out negative comments about the other members of Parliament who are part of the Your Party. I think there's 4 other MPs. All of whom are Muslim from the looks of it in the names, and all of whom she called them a sexist boys' club. Now, I mean, I felt like, where is John Cleese when you need him? And this is the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front. And I thought, it's just ridiculous how the left manages to shoot itself in the bloody foot all the time.
Yeah.
So Jeremy is still absolutely determined to push on and form Your Party, and then whatever it's called after the conference in November, and continue with those policies. But I have a feeling that the enthusiasm with people signed up, I think they had 800,000 people signed up, far larger than any other political party in the UK. But then this happened, and I think it just took the wind out of people. And now what we're seeing with Zach Polanski leading the Greens and doing a very enthusiastic and positive job and taking on the media when he goes and speaks to the media. He's not afraid to say the government doesn't borrow. He's actually pretty much putting the modern monetary theory case forward that the government is self-funding. He's got the guts to do that. He's made very good performer in general, and I think a lot of people who would have signed up to the All Party will now consider signing up to the Greens instead.
So so the question about why don't they all combine? Because there's not actually a lot of difference in what they're all claiming for. They've all got a progressive agenda. Okay, they've also all wedded to this idea that we can't go into too much government debt. But so they've all got the problem that they say, well, we want the government to spend more to fix stuff, but also we don't want to raise taxes.
It's certainly, it's obvious to me that Zach has got the message that the government is self-funding. So he's not worried about the government. He's not worried about the government issuing lots of bonds. Let's make it clear. That's what it amounts to. It's not going to debt, it's issuing bonds.
So
selling to the banks of the
why
private
don't
sector.
all the parties get together then and form one party? Why doesn't George Galloway say, yes, I'll be part of that? Or is there a bit of ego going on in all of this? I mean, there's
a bit of ego, definitely, but also, sorry, I feel like I should jump in here and put the break in. Do we dive in?
We'll do that now. Yeah, we'll take a break. Yeah, but I mean, this was my final question before the break. It's just why don't they all combine?
It's partly ego, definitely. I mean, George has obviously got an ego. Jeremy, less so obviously, but definitely. And he actually made a comment when we were talking after the event. He said, "I'm still standing. Everybody else is gone." So they talk about, obviously me being weak, etc., etc. He said, "Blair's gone. All these old rivals are gone. He's the one standing." So he's got that form of strength to him. And then you've got Polanski, who I think Polanski would be able to absorb anyone from the other groups. But in Corbyn's party, you have, if Zara Sultana remains part of it, she said there's no room in her party for anybody who's sexist or anti-gay or anti transvestite, etc., etc. Well, George is in his personal politics. He's a fairly classic conservative. He's a Catholic, a practicing Catholic. He says there are two sexes. You could say better than me. He wouldn't countenance the idea that there's an equivalent sex, or that a man can become a woman, etc., etc. All that stuff. That's the way. Okay, so what you get as a result of that, Zara would never joining with George, so you've got that political divide. So I don't think they can, and I think it'd be in some ways a mistake to attempt to do that, because to some extent there are working class, old-fashioned socialists who feel exactly the same way George does. They'll vote for George. You've got the modern group who feel like Zara does, they'll vote for her party. You've got those who think if ecology is the first important thing, they'll vote for the Greens. I think it'd be a mistake for those three parties to attempt to combine, unfortunately.
But it would also be a mistake if they're all standing in every single electorate exactly the same.
Which is why they'd have to say, okay, we'll make a political agreement. So a compact, not a single party, but a compact, a pledge that they will work out which party has got the best chances in each electorate, and they'll run one and only one candidate in each of those electorates, and the members of the other parties will come out and support and poll for the other party in each of those electorates. Okay? And that would give a potential to maximise the first past the post summer votes, and therefore get a progressive coalition in, not a coalition, just a compact. And then when it gets to Parliament, they'd have the majority of votes and they could select the Prime Minister that way.
You give very long answers when we're going to a break, don't you? We are going to take a break. We'll be back in just a second on the Debunking Economics. We're looking at the sad case of UK politics. Can it all be saved by the new left? We'll look at that again in just a second. So, Steve, if you look at the amount of money that is supposedly owed by the government, so in 2017, the total public sector net debt was £1.7 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio was 86.4%. In 2025, the total public sector net debt was 2.8 trillion. Okay, admittedly, we had a pandemic in the middle of that, which didn't help a great deal, and the debt to GDP ratio is 95.8%. But all around the world, those figures are going up and up and up. Like, look at what's happening in the United States. At what point do you think that political parties start to say, as they try and reel back from those high levels of debt and create enormous amounts of hurt through austerity in the process. At what point do you think they are going to start saying, hang on, is there another way through all of this where we don't have to worry too much about that debt to GDP ratio, where the government can take on more responsibility and spend more without having to worry about this? At what point does that happen?
That's why I was delighted I was invited to be this opening speaker at the second day of the conference, because I set the frame for the remainder of the conference, that all the things you're talking about in terms of restoring public health, restoring public education, taking sewerage and water back into public ownership, renationalising the railways, all that is doable. Yeah? You don't need to worry about the level of private debt. And just one of the obvious points there that's obvious to me because I know the data is that, yes, it's true, the government ratio of outstanding government bonds to GDP is just over 100%, but the ratio of outstanding private debt to GDP in the UK is 140%. And when you go back and look at the peak levels of debt, the peak level of government debt was during the COVID, and it exploded dramatically to 140%, but it fell within 5 years. It fell from 140% to 100%. But the peak level of private debt in the UK was 185%. So private debt is far larger and far more dangerous, and that's the message I managed to get through, I think, to the audience at Jeremy's party. So yes, you can say, don't worry about it. And in fact, if you want to reduce, what debt you want to reduce is private debt, not government debt.
Right, but if you reduce that private debt, you could be reducing investment, couldn't you?
No.
Investment.
Okay, because it isn't investment that's been financed. It's been speculation on house prices.
Yeah.
And that's the other major fact that it's...
So you don't necessarily want to reduce the debt per se. You want to reduce what it's used for. So if we have...
Well, you want to stop the private sector banks creating money for asset speculation, which is what they've done for the last 40 or 50 years. And this blind spot of mainstream economics, that's what private debt is actually used for, speculation rather than investment, is a huge part of the UK's problems. So they have to be aware that you've got to... The banks are the problem. Okay, they're not the solution; they're the problem. And at the banks, because it's easy to finance bricks and mortar. It's difficult to finance genuine investment. So they do the former rather than the latter. It's laziness fundamentally. And if you want to rebuild the private sector, then you need a banking sector that actually provides investment funds for entrepreneurs and working capital for corporations, which at the moment they pretty much ignore and just say, here's money to go and speculate on the share market or the housing market, and that's the last thing we need. Yeah,
they do help. And look, I'm not going to stand up for banks except to say that, because you're right, obviously, about that. And if you're a small business and try and get a loan, you're going to have to put your house up as a liability.
It's always collateral-based lending, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, they do also help large companies to issue bonds and to gain investment. So they are there as well, trying to get the right sort of investment for companies.
Well, I don't mind them doing the right sort of investment. I want to stop them doing the wrong sort of investment.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? And that means I want a set of regulations which are quite easy to draft that limit the level of lending to some multiple of the income earning reality or potential of the asset being purchased. That's what I call the PIL. It used to be a clever word back when people used the PIL for birth control, but property income limited leverage, things like that, to say you cannot have the level of pricing that if unlimited mortgage debt is what leads to unlimited house price inflation. So you need political parties that are willing to take the banks on and say, okay, yes, we're happy to have you lend to the private sector for investment. We're not happy you have lending for speculation. And it's easy to distinguish the two, or set up rules that link whatever you speculate on to the income flow out of what you're speculating on, and therefore burst the price to earnings ratio bubble that the shares get into. It's feasible to do that. You simply have to realise how banks actually operate, and this is what throws me so much when I'm, the role that I play in global economics is that it comes down to most of the problems of politics we've had is by having simplistic false models of what banks actually do. Yeah. And they're the ones promulgated by mainstream economists, which is why I fight them tooth and nail. It's bad economic theory that leads to bad political policies, and that's the situation for every country on the planet at the moment.
Yeah, and that lack of understanding about how government money works. So so the ideal policy then, and it doesn't seem to be that complicated, does it? Is to say that obviously you don't want to go crazy with this, but if the government spends money in kilter with the growth that you're expecting in the economy, we've talked about this before, haven't you? If they spend well below the expected GDP, they just go crazy, then there's going to be a lack of confidence in that government. But if they are sensible, heading in a direction and saying, well, okay, we're going to spend more, and that's going to be covered by the bonds that we issue, and most of those bonds will probably be bought back in the private sector. But we are not displacing money in doing that because we are putting money into the economy. So we're adding money to the economy, and that is being negated by the money that's being used to buy those bonds. But we're putting that money into the economy. So we're able to do all the stuff that we wanted to do. Most people would say if the government is spending money, then the private sector is losing money.
That's the false.
That's the mistake that everyone makes.
That's the mistake they're making. Like if you watch some of the neoclassicals putting this forward, what they think is there's government savings and private savings. I actually played a video from a mainstream economist making that claim on YouTube. So their belief is that if the government spends less than it takes back in taxation, that's savings which is available to invest elsewhere. Now, that is a completely false model of banking, because when you look at what bank accounts are, they're a liability of the private banks. They're an asset for the private sector that has those those deposit accounts. And if you add up the assets and the liabilities in that operation, you get zero. Okay? And this is the rule of financial assets. Financial assets are claims on somebody else. Financial liabilities are other people's claims on you. Because for every financial asset, there's a financial liability. The sum of all of them is zero. So it turns out the sum of public and private savings is zero. And if you want to have the private sector saving, the government has to dissave. And I put that in terms of positive and negative equity. So if you want the private sector, the households and banks, to have more financial assets than they have financial liabilities, the only way that can be done is the government has more financial liabilities than it has financial assets. It's a seesaw, which is the way I put the analogy across in Jeremy's conference. So with the seesaw, if you want private savings, the government has to run a deficit. And the deficit of the government, literally to the dollar, is the surplus for the private sector. And therefore the private sector can save. And the more the government does that deficit, in fact, the more funds that are available for the private sector. So everything that's being taught by mainstream economists, and I use this expression in the conference, is arse about tit to the real world.
Mm. And the government can then say, well, okay, we're going to provide the infrastructure that's going to help the private sector grow.
Exactly. And this is what you see in China on a massive scale, because like some of the huge projects in China involve putting gigantic bridges across impossible gorges that mean that what used to be an 80-kilometre journey becomes an 8-kilometre journey. And then suddenly, business which was not feasible on either side of that gorge is now feasible. So in fact, the state, by doing this stuff, reduces the cost for the private sector and enables them to do more investment. And that's why we've got China showing us a sign of massive public investment at the same time as massive private investment. Economists teach that one crowds out the other. In fact, one encourages the other.
Yeah, crowding in. I've heard you use that.
Crowding in.
Before.
And I've got to put a shout out to an old mate of mine, died about 10, 15 years ago, Colm Kearney, who was professor of economics at University of Western Sydney when I worked. He actually hired me. And Colm's research speciality, and I met him before I became an academic, was in showing that when you do the statistical analysis, you don't find crowding out, you find crowding in. There's a positive correlation between net government deficits and private sector investment. And the reason for that is, again, twofold. when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it's putting money in people's bank accounts, and hey presto, they spend that money. Isn't that strange? And so there's more turnover, and then also because the government provides infrastructure that enables the private sector to, they put the shops either side of the bridge. The private sector is encouraged by public investment. It's only when you get to the stage where you're fighting a world war, where everything is taken by the public sector to fight the other side, that you find a crowding out that applies, and it's on the other side, the private sector builds the weapons. So the crowding out is just a fallacy, and one of many fallacies in economic theory that have led to the bad politics of the last half century.
But it's not just the politicians, is it, or the public's lack of understanding?
That's the trouble, yeah.
There's also the bond vigilantes. So the moment the government says, right, we're going to spend more, the bond vigilantes will go, well, if you're going to spend more, we're going to pay less for bonds because you're issuing more bonds. We're going to pay less for them. We are therefore going to increase the yields, and those yields then reflect everything from mortgage rates to how much banks are lending money out. So it becomes more expensive, first of all, for the government to pay that money. But we don't care about that. More to the point, it becomes more expensive for everybody else to borrow. So it slows down private sector investment. But that is because of a lack of understanding, isn't it?
It's garbage. Again, that's a completely false argument.
It's garbage with a lot of money behind it, and they're the people who...
Garbage with a lot of money behind it. And what we've had is people have swallowed mainstream economic theory without knowing that theory is based on a set of fallacies about how the government operates. And the fallacy, the most damaging fallacy is the argument that they call loanable funds, that there's a market which you can show using supply and demand diagrams. You've got to have the X somewhere. And that's how the banking sector operates. It's total fallacy. So the bond vigilantes thing, this is the one that I also punctured in that speech, is that the initial sale of bonds are made by the central bank, and you have to have an account at the central bank to bid. So the bond vigilantes, if they exist, have to have accounts at the central bank. Now, what are those accounts? We call them reserves. If you add up this total amount of money in those reserve accounts, or funds, I'm not going to call it money, funds in those reserve accounts, they total in the UK's accounts to roughly 30% of GDP. Now, the UK has about 100 gilt auctions, as they're called, every year, so once every 2 or 3 days. And that means on average, and they vary wildly, but the average is therefore the value of bonds put up for sale is equivalent to 0.1% of GDP in each of those 100 auctions on average. That means that the amount of funds sitting in reserve accounts are 300 times the amount of funds necessary to buy all the bonds at each auction. Okay? So there's a process that turns over regularly. Now, when you look again at bank accounts, reserve accounts are just like our demand deposits. Okay, you can move the money around whatever you want instantly. But bonds are a bit like term deposits for us. You can't move the money as easily, but you get a higher rate of interest. So the banks have got a choice. Leave the funds in the reserve accounts where we don't need anything like 30% of GDP in those funds. But why do you swap them for a higher interest rate in bonds? And that's what they do. So there's never... The bond vigilantes don't even get a seat at the table in the initial auction. They only get a seat at the table when it comes to when the private banks resell those bonds to the non-bank financial institutions and the non-bank private sector. Right.
But obviously that's happening because we see, as we're seeing in the UK now, we're saying it's a bad Labour government, but they have, invested more in capital works. I mean, they did divide the way their accounting works to say, well, okay, we are going to invest in capital, and we're not, we're going to see that as a longer term investment, and so that's not part of our operational expenditure in effect. So we can borrow more. I mean, they have put that new structure in place, which I'm sure you would agree is a sensible step forward. But because they, at the same time, are having difficulty trying to meet the funding requirements, not for that capex, but for their main operational budgets, they're getting screwed by the bond markets that have seen yields going higher and higher and higher. And it's because of this lack of confidence that they're going to be able to deliver.
Which, of course, is a false confidence. In terms of paying the interest on the bonds, there's no problem in them doing that. But the secondary market is extremely volatile. It's the biggest market on the planet.
And
banks are in there playing it. Yeah.
And they're calling the shots. So even though Jeremy Corbyn...
No, they're calling the shots. They're walking around town like they call the shots. Okay?
Well, yeah.
They haven't got Colt 45s. They've got pop guns.
Right, well, they're doing a lot with those pop guns, aren't they? Because they're driving the price of bonds down. Even though you're saying they're not holding many of them, they're held in the majority are held by banks in reserves. They're still managing to drive the price of bonds down because banks won't be doing that, and consequently yields going up, interest rates are going up. I mean that's and so the reason I'm raising that is because if Jeremy Corbyn or whoever says, well, here's here's a bold new future where the government can spend more money and we're going to get also private sector investment. You've got to convince not just the electorate, you've got to convince the city as well that this is the way to operate, and it shouldn't mean that this is an economy being managed badly. I mean, that's what it gets down to, isn't it? They think, oh, this is badly managed, therefore we haven't got confidence in government bonds anymore, so we're not going to pay as much for them.
Well, in that case, we're going to disagree here, mate, because the bond market dynamics affect the secondary market. Okay, they cannot affect the primary. That's the first point. And the confidence of the bond markets changes the rate mainly on long-dated bonds.
Yeah.
That's what causes things to trust.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but the thing is, the floor is still set by the central bank. And now, I think the people that the new political parties have to get on side, so to speak, is the central bank itself, because the reason interest rates are high is because central banks are managed by neoclassical economists who believe that inflation is caused by inflationary expectations. So if you reduce inflationary expectations, you reduce the rate of inflation, and that's why the interest rates are high right now, to reduce inflationary expectations. It's a fairy story. It's just as much of a fairy story as the bond vigilantes. The main control on inflation is not the interest rate. It's the capacity of firms to put up markups on labour costs. It's the capacity of workers to get wage rises, and it's then difficulties in supply, whether that's improving technology or rising energy costs. Those are the fundamental causes of inflation. It shouldn't be something the central bank attempts to control, because their instrument, the interest rate, does not control it. What does control it to some extent is the level of money creation. So you would have and we saw this during COVID, the fact that there was so much money created during COVID gave firms the potential to put up markups. And then because you had a booming economy at the same time, ultimately, workers get wage rises as well. So the impact, the government, normally what causes inflation is conflict over the distribution of income, which the UK has got in spades, technological progress, which the UK pretty much lacks, and then rising energy costs, which the UK suffers from for both internal mismanagement reasons and also because it's no longer a major oil exporter. So you've got to tame the neoclassical economists. I would worry less about the bond market and more about the economists in the central bank making the wrong decisions, because they're following a fantasy theory of economics.
Yeah, and yet the reason I'm mentioning it is because August 2019, that yield on 30-year, as you say, the most important one really for long-term borrowing, was 1% in August 2019. In September 23, it was 4.58%. In September 25, and all that's changed is a lack of confidence in the government, it's up to 5.57%. So from 1% to getting on for 6%, that is a material cost for companies wanting to borrow. They're not going to borrow as much.
It's a material cost imposed by the central bank economists believing a fantasy theory about investment. Okay, so if you get rid of the fantasy theory, there's no reason for the rates to be as high as they are.
Right, but the 30-year yield is less influenced by the government, central bank's set interest rate, because that's short duration. It has
but
less influence on 30 years. 30 years, 30 years is driven by market expectations of where they're heading.
It is, but it's also, I mean, the government has to issue those bonds in the first place.
Yeah.
And when it issues those in the primary auctions, the yield is whatever the government has decided the yield is. Now, that's the central bank that decides that yield. So if we said, look, forget about it, your interest rates do not influence inflation, sound post-Keynesian economic research has found that it's irrelevant to inflation rate. What really fixes the, basically, conflict over the distribution of income. And if we can actually direct that instead and reduce that conflict, then you're going to reduce inflation that way. And higher technological progress, that's obviously the thing the UK is badly lacking in right now. Energy, that's another issue which is more difficult to address. That's how you attack inflation. Drop the interest rates. They shouldn't be 5, they should be, say, 2. And then when the initial bond auction occurs, those 30 years will have a yield of 2%, okay, to the decimal point, roughly. And then what happens in the secondary market is another story again. Now, this is, to me, the secondary market.
When you were talking to Jeremy Corbyn and his party?
I only had 30 minutes, mate, not 30 days.
So you've got to do that too, haven't you? You can't.
There's a huge need to rearrange economic policy for these new political parties.
So you take my point, though. If you didn't do that, otherwise, all of this approach would get killed by the bond markets.
But you see, you've got to see the central bank almost killed the bond market itself by putting up rates.
Yeah.
Because as you know, if you increase the rates on long-yielded bonds, the longer the yield, the more the effect is. That reduces the value of those bonds. So putting up interest rates after 30 years of falling interest rates or more, I go back to the 1970s to have the peak of interest rates, 70s, late 80s. So 40 years of falling interest rates meant that anybody who bought bonds was in for a capital gain. But then when you have rising interest rates, anybody buys a bond gets a capital loss. And that's what happened to the pension funds because they increased from 1% to 5%. If they were really long-dated bonds like consols, that would reduce the value of the funds by 80%. So bonds you paid £1,000 for will be valued at £200.
Yeah.
Now that's what almost drove pension funds. So that should be something which is obvious to the economists setting these policies. But clearly it wasn't. Okay? So that again comes down to how primitive economic theory is.
Yeah, and it's worse now, of course, because those prices are low and the yields are higher than it was during the micro budget from Liz Truss. So arguably the situation is worse right now. It's just taken longer, so people have adjusted to it, I guess. So so there's another part of the equation. You've got to go back and talk to Jeremy and give him the other part of the story.
I hope to have lots of conversations, but with not just him, with George and with Zach as well. That there can only be a new politics if there's a new economics.
Right.
The new economics exists. It's just that these political parties have a chance to harness it. The Labor and Tory will never do that. So that's why I think there's a chance for a real phase shift in British politics as we approach the next election. Now,
next week, we got an email from Mark Slater, who's a listener, pointing us to an Andy Burnham reference. Andy Burnham is the mayor of Manchester, who hopes to be the next Prime Minister or the next leader of the Labour Party. I think he's seen the writing on the wall. But he's got a bit to learn as well. He was talking about that he wants to stop foreign investment. In particular, he wants foreigners to stop buying government bonds. But I thought that's an opportune moment for us next week to just look at foreign money coming into the country, what forms it takes, what's good and what's bad, and how that should influence government policy. That's a fairly meaty one. We'll talk about that next week. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, mate. Bye.